Brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.
Richard Mosse is an Irish photographer and filmmaker who immerses himself in his subject, integrating documentary journalism and art practice to explore issues of conflict, displacement and perception.
So Richard has deliberately set out to challenge, probe and question and unpick traditional ways of looking.
Richard is part of a wider generation of photographers who've begun to question the documentary truths of photography, its claims to authenticity, to objectivity, to truth, because they have found them wanting.
He's one of only 2 photographers ever to have won both the Deutsche Borse Prize and the Prix Pictet, 2 of photography's most prestigious international awards.
When you saw those photographs, straight away you feel you're very close with those victims.
He is someone who thinks long and hard before he does something, prepares for it incredibly rigorously, surrounds himself with an extraordinary crew of people who all seem in tune with his vision. And, you know, he's a collaborative artist who works in a very, very deep way.
You know, as a documentarian, one has to sort of allow the world to reveal itself in the process of making. And you've got to be in the field and you've got to wait. You've got to be out there and you've got to be trying, and there's going to be a lot of failure. And through that failure, you'll understand the situation.
The island of Chios in Greece has been at the heart of the European refugee crisis and has become one of 2 main points of entry into Europe. Richard is working on his latest award-winning project, Heat Maps, a detailed documentation of Europe's refugee camps. He's spent 3 years embedded in the crisis, working closely with local crew member Daphne Tollis.
You know what nationality most of the refugees are these days?
Syrians are still number 1. You know, then it's Afghans and Iraqis.
Richard's first encounter with the Middle East was in Iraq in 2009 during the US-led invasion, where he photographed the palaces of Saddam Hussein under occupation by US soldiers.
And there's this tension between the grandiosity of these imperial palaces in juxtaposition alongside the US military who had occupied these spaces. But he was doing that all in a very different way because he was a much more kind of documentary realism. And I think after that body of work, he had a bit of a moment of reflection, of thinking about where can I take this work?
I suppose my whole practice exists in this interstitial space between documentary photography and contemporary art. And I suppose the reason for that is to challenge the conventions of documentary photography, of photojournalism, but also to attempt to find alternate approaches.
I already thought that this sort of interesting tension between fiction and reality, which he was already developing there, was making him an interesting photographer. So I was watching him from that date.
After Iraq, Richard made a radical break from traditional reportage, spending 5 years in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he developed his book, Infra, released in 2012.
I suppose I'm trying to sort of hybridize those 2 worlds and bring them together, smash them together sometimes, in order to ask questions rather than provide answers.
I think he is one of the most radical in what he has done to challenge those conventions, and has, as a result, inflamed the traditional lobby of the photojournalists by doing that.
1 year later, Richard exhibited The Enclave, a 6-screen video installation representing Ireland at the Venice Biennale. He was later awarded one of photography's most prestigious prizes, the Deutsche Borse Prize, for his depictions of the conflict.
My work in Congo, it began in 2010 and continued until 2015. And really what I was trying to engage with there was the overlooked, the almost unseen aspect of the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. One statistic about Eastern DRC says that 5.4 million people have died of war-related causes since 1998. And that's a huge number of people. We don't really hear about it in the Western press. It's not really hitting the papers in the way it should, you know, with that number, the death toll is profound.
Well, I was a journalist there looking at the effect of British oil companies in Eastern DRC.
While in the Congo, Richard met journalist Taimur Lay, who's since become a human rights lawyer representing refugees in Europe.
But it was immediately apparent that he was seeking to find a different way to look at and present the Democratic Republic of Congo.
So Congo's woes really began with Western colonialization, European colonialization, and then following independence, a very corrupt politician named Mobutu was installed with the encouragement of the Americans and the Belgians. So it's a very, very layered and convoluted conflict with many different aspects, from the local to the geopolitical. Not an easy one to communicate, and which is, I believe, why the mass media has failed so badly to communicate a lot of that humanitarian disaster. And so the way I engaged with that problem, that sort of failure to reveal the hidden or the unseen, I chose to employ a military surveillance film from World War II, actually, Kodak Aerochrome. So this film was discontinued in 2009.
The Kodak Aerochrome picks up the chlorophyll in healthy green plants, turning them extraordinary pinks and reds. It was used traditionally by the military to try and identify soldiers from the air.
I wanted to bring this hidden quality, this overlooked situation, into collision with a film technology that is, after all, designed to reveal the invisible. It's designed to detect what we can't perceive. These metaphoric concerns of the unseen, the hidden and the invisible were central to my work in Congo. A lot of the photography in infra is portraiture, but there's plenty of the work that I did there was mapping sites of human rights violations. Over the decades, many of these gorgeous places would also been the sites of massacres, human rights violations, intimidation, sexual violence. There's a disconnect there between the beauty and the narrative at stake. And so I was trying to sort of bring that pressure into a breaking point.
It challenges you and makes you think in a way that photojournalism doesn't. Photojournalism often really just holds your hand and then leads you to a particular destination of thought.
One of the criticisms of Richard's work is often that he aestheticizes suffering. It's a common criticism of other artists such as Salgado.
There's a huge debate in photography writing, for instance, about the aestheticizing of suffering.
I sort of take issue with this idea that one shouldn't engage and employ the aesthetic potential of the medium of photography. I believe aesthetics is a powerful tool of communication. It's the sharpest tool in the box. And I also believe that aesthetics can be seen as the opposite of anesthetic. It can be used to awaken the senses rather than put you to sleep.
After the break, we meet Richard at his hideaway retreat in Ireland. Photographer and filmmaker Richard Mosse is at his quiet hideaway home in Ireland, where he retreats to process over a decade of documenting conflict around the world.
So this is my home in the west of Ireland, in the Burren, County Clare. I grew up in a Quaker family, actually, in County Kilkenny in Ireland, which is quite an artistic community. And my parents are both hippies, and they believe deeply in self-sufficiency. In the early 1980s, a documentary film was made by an Irish filmmaker named David Shaw Smith about my father and his pottery. And I feature in the nip, playing music on various pots in that film from when I was only 3 years old. And I feel very lucky to have grown up around artists. I made all my work in Iraq and Congo and Gaza with this camera. This is an 8x10 inch format camera, so it's a large format camera. It's made of wood. This has literally been through the wars. It's kind of seen better days. So I would have brought this to, say, Congo, where I would have walked into the bush for days usually to meet armed groups and document them. I suppose all my work has a relation to photojournalism, and it's kind of, it has two subjects. One, of course, is the subject that I'm trying to address, and the other is photography itself. The reason I use such a contraption instead of a normal camera is that you have to really think carefully through the composition. It helps me slow down and commit to an image, but also it produces an image that's it's very different. It's very much to do with the space.
In 2006, Richard was accepted to the prestigious photography program at Yale, where he would discover a problem that's remained present in his work to this day, that of the unseen or impossible image.
He was incredibly prolific, and I think he made 12 projects in the space of 2 years, which is kind of incredible. And he also travelled to the US-Mexican border to photograph the traces of the migrants who were trying to make their way from Mexico to the US.
Because I went down there quite naively to document illegal immigrants coming across the border. Naturally, you can't see them. I almost gave up, and then I found a bag by the side of the road, actually. And I kind of emptied out all the stuff inside, and I found a woman's life. I was able to piece together a narrative. In a way, it tells the story fabulously. But who knows if it's in any way actually related to actual refugees or migrants. In other words, that could have just been a pile of garbage. So I suppose I was liberated. I had crossed the threshold into fiction in order to more adequately tell documentary narratives of reality, which is what writers do all the time. So yeah, so that was a first baby step for me into my current practice.
All great photographers are storytellers, but he turns it a little bit on its head, and I think that's why he is often criticised for some of his approaches to storytelling.
This approach is almost transgressive, you know? I'm not sure if it really breaks any rules, but discomfits the viewer on some level. It puts them in an awkward space where they have to confront themselves in the act of viewing, hopefully. I think it's very important that people engage in are able to communicate with these narratives, and I think that we have a moral imperative to know what's going on in the world. And an artist can bring a different sort of a set of concerns. They can ask questions instead of answering them. And they also, you know, as an artist, you have the potential to really dig a bit deeper.
Richard goes on to spend 3 years documenting the European refugee crisis. After the break, we return to Greece to join Richard on that journey. On the Greek island of Chios, photographer and filmmaker Richard Mosse and fixer Daphne are working on his 2017 Prix Pictet award-winning project Heat Maps. Using advanced military technology, which sees heat instead of light, Richard has documented Europe's refugee camps in extraordinary detail.
And guide me in.
Yeah, okay.
It can image the human body from 30.3 kilometers, which is about 18 miles, day or night. There's a certain amount of faith involved here. Okay. The camera itself was designed primarily for battlefield situational awareness, as well as long-range border enforcement.
Each heat map is composited from around 900 individual still frames, taken from the original video source footage that documents the refugee camp. These are painstakingly unified to produce a final panoramic photograph showing the thermal index of the camp's architecture and life within.
Refugees leave everything behind them, especially the warmth of the home. They literally leave the heat behind them. And they put themselves in great danger. Many of them die of exposure. They risk their lives on the cold sea waves. Homes are replaced by tents and shelters. And it's a struggle literally for survival, for bodily warmth. And so I suppose the portrayal of these journeys and these staging sites through a thermal camera
at least to me, it has this metaphoric resonance of heat and human warmth.
I actually found the camera to be incredibly intimate, even though at certain points it was filming from whatever, 10 kilometers away, this extraordinary thing. And at other moments, incredibly visceral.
One of the debates that have been triggered by Richard's work is that he uses this technology at the expense of his subjects, that it's used to dehumanize them.
One effect of the depersonalizing of the image is actually the individual's identities are protected. So rather than the technology depersonalizing in a negative sense like that, I actually saw it as a protection of them. So look at this person, feel what they're feeling, try to empathize, but you don't need to know their name. You don't need to see their face. Imagine that. Imagine it.
Alongside heat maps, Richard has worked with his long-term collaborators, cinematographer Trevor Tweeton and composer Ben Frost, to create Incoming, a 52-minute multi-screen video installation.
Filming the plight of the refugees trying to find sanctuary in Europe. They're fleeing from persecution, from poverty, from war, from climate change as well. Of course, between 2014 and 2017, the press were looking at this huge migration of people which we hadn't experienced since the Second World War. And of course, our position, our response to this humanitarian crisis has been utterly different.
One scene in particular in Incoming really plays to the specific strengths of the camera, and we were able to use the camera to show actual live battle in the village of Dabiq, which is a very important village for Islamic State. In terms of the visual language of the piece of Incoming, we were able to really show how the camera was designed to be used, as well as to really enforce the reasons for this wave of displacement, and that is conflict. So the fighting in Syria, as well as Iraq, and also in places like Afghanistan, that's contributed to enormous displacement of huge numbers of people who are just seeking safety.
They telling the audience why the people's fleeing and what's the outcome of that situation and where this situation come from. They don't have anything to lose, only they try to across the border, they try to across the sea, and they're looking for the safe place.
So I suppose I wanted to take this powerful tool and to use it against itself in a way. Almost a moral imperative to sort of remind and confront the viewer that this is the way our governments perceive, objectify the body of the refugee. It confronts the viewer with not just the reality that the refugee is struggling through and surviving, but also the reality of how our governments approach the refugee crisis. It's very much a defensive one. It's about control. It's about border enforcement.
Richard's work actually makes us complicit in what we're seeing, because it's being used on my and our behalf to protect the borders of a country whose passport I hold. The view of these individuals as a military threat through the lens of this camera has reached such a peak that this is the lengths to which a surveillance society will go.
In 2015, over 1 million refugees arrived on the shores of Europe by sea, averaging 3,000 to 4,000 daily in Greece. One night, Richard and his crew witness a boat of 300 people sink before reaching the shore of Lesbos.
From a distance of about 10 kilometers, we were able to watch this tragedy occurring with the camera. Most of that scene is played out in total darkness, simply because it's too disturbing.
Make some space around us, please. We're too close. Half a step back.
We went down to the port and we kept a good distance to avoid disturbing the important work at hand. And we had the sort of luxury of doing that because we had a camera that could telescope in. The first people on the scene were local fishermen and volunteers.
Okay. And I will give 10 compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
And it was literally a scene from hell. With limited amounts of resources, so there were volunteers but also emergency workers really desperately against the clock to revive these people.
I can hardly get in the area.
particularly the children, were unable to really last that long in the water. Very, very tragic, upsetting scenes. Emergency workers were running out of oxygen and people were panicking. And they were holding one child up by her heels and slapping her as hard as I could on her back.
Too much water there is in the lunch.
In order to force the water out, creating a kind of a frothy blood coming out of the mouth. And sadly, that girl, who was revived, eventually died. She died the next day of what they call second drowning.
Even for me, I mean, it's a refugee crisis, but I've also felt that I was going through a crisis while covering this, because I wasn't prepared for what I saw and what happened in all these places that I was, borders closing, people protesting, or people dying on the beach, and like seeing that, all this despair.
With the human eye, you can't see the heat print from a hand. But this camera was able to actually see that friction of heat, of the life-giving warmth back into the lives, into the bodies of these victims. So on some level, it was the most appropriate tool I could possibly imagine to tell that particular story.
This moment, which I think will become one of the most defining moments of our modern era, this kind of humanitarian crisis that we failed to respond to. And Richard, in a most simple way, I think, is trying to make us look at this and know it better.
There's no body count. It was impossible for journalists to really adequately say how many people died that day. This goes on all the time.
Incoming is a 52-minute harrowing experience full of beauty and emotion, and by and large, I would say the majority of people coming to see the show stayed for the full 52 minutes, and some even watched it 2 or 3 times in a row.
There was a very palpable silence and attentiveness from the people who were experiencing it. I was going to say watching it, but you're not watching it. It's so overwhelming that you sort of have to surrender to it.
It is very hard to say that story we saw when we was flee in a war zone. Myself, in 1991, in the first Cold War, I was walking 4 days to Iran without food, without anything. More than 3 million Kurdish people. So Richard exhibitions remind me that story and how the people's living in the camp.
Refugees often say to me when I finally meet them, when they get to the UK usually, and I'm representing them in court, they say, why am I being treated like a criminal? Why am I being seen as a criminal? And that's something I thought of when I was looking at Incoming.
Footage captured during the making of Incoming is being considered as evidence for a potential criminal investigation into a human trafficking incident.
I feel this speaks to the power of documentary photography, which can have numerous lives and can affect change in different ways. It can have a cultural life, speak to people and their social consciousness, but it also can create change politically. It can be used as evidence in a court of law, and it can, confront human perception and hopefully create a discourse through which potentially we can find a common ground.
Brilliant ideas, powered by Hyundai Motor.